Hi everyone, I am Keaton Kira here. Welcome to my series on high level entertainment. Philidor once said that pawns are the soul of chess. It's a famous quote, and he would have been proud to see these two games that we're going to look at today, where white starts off the game with several consecutive pawn moves, kind of flying in the face of everything that we learn when we're first learning chess, right? Our coaches tell us maybe a couple of pawn moves, control the center, but then you got to develop your pieces. You got to castle your king. Well, not if you're Frank Marshall or Georgian Grandmaster Tomas Gelashvili, whose games we're going to see today. Frank Marshall, of course, with that very famous Queen Sacrifice that he played against Stefan Levitsky, a move that many people refer to as the greatest move of all time. But not everyone knew that Frank Marshall also had a game where he opened the game with 14 consecutive pawn moves before he ever moved a piece. And we're going to see that game today. So Frank Marshall was playing white against Hyman Rogozin, and Marshall starts out with e4. Black played the Sicilian, and Frank Marshall went with the Sicilian wing gambit, b4. White captured on b4, and now a3. White gambits the pawn in order for him to get more central control, possibly develop his bishop out on a3 and open up the queen side, almost kind of like a Banco gambit with white. Black goes knight to c6. Pawn takes b4. Pawn moves only. Knight f6. But this allows white a nice opportunity. He goes b5. Continues to advance his pawns and give those black knights some problems. Knight to d4. Only logical, c3. Kick that knight back. Knight e6, e5. Marshall decides to have some fun with that other knight. Knight to d5, c4. Those black knights just keep getting chased around. Knight from d to f4. Now g3, another pawn move attacking a knight. Knight to g6, and now f4, threatening not only to go f5, forking the two knights, but that knight on g6 would also be getting trapped. After f5, maybe that knight could take on e5, but then another pawn move d4, and that knight's going to be actually trapped there in the center. So black decides to sacrifice a knight for two pawns. Knight takes f4, pawn takes f4, and Frank Marshall says, why not another pawn move? d4, now attacking that knight with his bishop. The knight goes back to g6, h4, preparing h5 to trap the knight. e6, h5, and now black played bishop b4 check, actually forcing white to move a piece. Otherwise, he may well have made another pawn move. Bishop d2 now. Pawn moves are over. Bishop takes d2. Knight takes d2. But keep in mind, before Frank Marshall even moved a piece, he already had a winning position. He was up a piece for two pawns, and his pawns actually give him very good central control. They control a lot of space. Both of white's rooks are open, have excellent scope, and black hasn't exactly been developing a lot of pieces himself. He's been spending time moving his attack knights around the board. So, knight e7. Now knight e4. Eyeing some very nice squares. Knight f5. h6. Provoking this g7 pawn to move, which will open up the f6 square for the knight. So black goes g6. Knight f6 check. King f8. And simply knight f3. Black goes d6, trying to open up the position a little bit, but knight to g5. Look at those white knights, how powerful they are. No need to move the queen, the rooks, or the bishop. D takes e5, d takes, and now white's very happy to go into the endgame which is a completely winning endgame. Black is paralyzed here. He tries king e7, rook h3, bringing the other rook into the game. After b6, bishop g2 attacking the rook. And after knight takes h7, black is completely toast here, and he resigns. For our second game today, we have a USCL showdown. Playing white is the Georgian Grandmaster Tamaz Gelashvili, and black is the American rising star Sam Shankland. And so Gelashvili played e4, and Shankland went with one of his favorite weapons, the Caro-Kann. And Gelashvili played the advanced variation, and after bishop f5, played a trendy move here, h4, with the idea to run his pawns on the king side, take space, and to give that bishop some problems. So black played h6, following theory, and after g4, brought the bishop back to d7, and now Gelashvili just calmly played h5, taking more space on the king side. We're going to see again white starting the game with a barrage of pawn moves. So after e6, white goes f4, taking even more space on the king side. And after c5, white responds with c3, a very logical move, supporting the center. So the reason that white's been able to get away with making so many pawn moves at the start in these games is because black hasn't exactly been quick about getting developed. In the first game, he was just moving his knights around the board, and in this game, black's made several pawn moves himself and also made some bishop moves. So with the position being this closed, it's not a real risk for white. But still, this idea of moving so many pawns in the opening, it's not something that I would really recommend to try at home. It's very risky, and it can get you into a lot of trouble. The best way, usually, to play the opening is the conventional way of developing your pieces. It's just that in these examples, white's able to get away with it in a little bit more closed positions when there's not a lot of risk to the king. But still, you have to be very careful. And games where someone's been able to successfully employ such a strategy are few and far between. It's why it's such an anomaly in chess. But of course, it's cool and it's interesting to look at. So that's why I'm featuring the idea in this video. So black played knight c6, developing the knight to a natural square and putting pressure on white's center. So white responds knight f3, finally moving a piece toward the center and protecting the pawn. And black plays queen b6, going for typical counterplay here with pressure on the b2 pawn, which makes it hard for white to develop his dark bishop, and also keeping pressure on that central pawn on d4. And this might be a good time to see if you can find the next move for white. It's certainly not a winning move by any stretch, but I think it's a strong move that allows white to advance his position, and it's not necessarily something that would jump right out at most people. So this would be a good chance to pause your video and challenge yourself to find the interesting move that white played here. Gelashvili played the move rook to h2, which is a strong move because the rook is actually very powerful along the second rank. It defends the b2 pawn, which frees up this dark bishop to move, and it also does a nice job of defending the second rank and defending the king. I think the reason that a lot of people would be hesitant to play a move like rook h2, we're not really used to making these kinds of moves that would prevent white from castling. But white really doesn't need to castle in this position. There's no danger to his king, and he easily has enough time to castle by hand. Remember, in closed positions, development is not as important as compared to open positions where someone can easily mobilize their forces and get a quick attack against the king. As long as the center is closed and the position remains closed, you can get away with doing stuff like moving a lot of pawns and neglecting your king safety a little bit, as long as there's no way for your opponent to get an attack. Shanklin tries to play actively here with rook c8, putting the rook on the c file, which will be powerful if these pawns are ever exchanged. White plays now bishop e3, a good developing move that solidifies the center. C takes d4, c takes d4, and bishop b4 check. But White's next move should not be a big surprise, as he can't castle kingside anyway, so he has no real castling privileges to forfeit, so he just goes ahead and goes king f2, where here White can easily hand castle by simply putting his king on g1, and if you hadn't seen the game, you would probably never know the difference. You just assume that he had castled. So Black goes now knight a5. Gelashvili plays a nice restricting move here, playing against that knight, which wants to come into c4. He naturally plays b3. And this undeveloped knight on b1 is still doing White a nice service of keeping that bishop out of c3. Even undeveloped pieces can sometimes perform a useful function. Black plays knight e7. White plays king g1, completing the hand castle, now that rook once again owns the second rank. Black castles, a little bit risky here, castling into these advanced pawns. White goes rook g2, preparing now for a kingside attack. Why not? The pawns are already up the board. Black goes rook c7, preparing perhaps the double rooks on the c-file, which Black owns. And here, Gelashvili found a very cool idea. A very nice positional attacking idea. This would be a good chance to pause the videos and see if you can find what the Grandmaster came up with. So the natural move for White here would be g5. The rook is on the g file. The plan is to attack. g5 looks very natural, but g5 has a problem. It weakens the square on f5, which would allow the knight to come in with gain of tempo, which would be a very strong defensive piece here on f5, as well as creating a big threat here, threatening the bishop on e3. And White finds a very nice way around that. He first pushes f5, a strong attacking move in and of itself, which requires White to capture with the pawn. But now what White's done is he's plugged this square with a black pawn, which prevents Black's knight from coming into f5. So White now is able to go g5, as he wanted to anyway, without having to worry about the knight coming into that square. It's a very nice positional play. Black continues king h7, getting that king off the g file, as White was threatening g takes h6. And now bishop d3, moving the bishop for the first time onto a strong diagonal, where it x-rays the king. Rook fc8, and now king h2, tucking that king away, getting it off the dark diagonal where it's being x-rayed by the queen, as White prepares to make what could be the final assault against Black's king. Black continues bishop b5, trading his quote-unquote bad bishop for White's good bishop. Black's bishop, since it's the same color as his central pawn, technically a bad bishop. But White is actually happy to trade here and pull that queen off of the 6th rank, because now Black's king position is further weakened. After g takes h6, Black recaptures g takes h6, and now Black has a lot of problems on the king side. White continues a3, bringing the bishop into c3, and now a very nice attacking idea for White. If you're interested, pause your videos, see if you can find White's continuation. White played a very nice move. Bishop takes h6, taking away all cover from the Black king. If the king were to take, now after queen c1 check, Black would be hopelessly lost. the king would have to go back to h7, and now knight g5 check will decide the game. If the king were to stay on the h file, simply knight takes f7 check, followed by queen h6 checkmate. And if the king goes on the g file, here it's possible to go knight e6 double check, which forces checkmate. For example, king h7, rook g7 check, and queen h6 ends the game. So after bishop takes h6, black is unable to capture that bishop, so he grabs the rook on a1. But now white finishes the game very nicely with knight g5 check. The king is forced to take the bishop, and after white's next move, black had no other option but to resign. If you'd like, pause the video, see if you can find the final move of the game. White is down a lot of material here, but it doesn't matter, as black's king is about to suffer a grim fate after queen to d2, lining the queen up with the black king and preparing a winning discovered check. I think the only defensive idea that black can try here is knight to g6, blocking the g file. Otherwise, white's just going to go knight takes f7 double check, followed by queen h6 mate. So probably the best defense here would be knight to g6. But here white's winning by force, as his queen and rook are going to start to coordinate very well, along with the help from this very strong e5 pawn. Galashvili probably had a feeling when he was making all these pawn moves in the opening that taking that space would help the white position later on, and it really is helping here after knight takes f7 double check, forcing king g7, and now the key is queen h6 check, bringing the queen into the attack. After king takes knight, queen takes g6 check, it looks like the black king can escape toward the queen side, but it can't because of this powerful pawn on e5, which sets the white queen up for a winning check on either f6 or d6, and many forced checkmating combinations here, because after this the white rook is going to enter the attack, and there's nowhere that the black king can escape to. For instance, after king d7, rook g7 check would force king e8, and now one of many checkmates here would be queen e6, or after king f8, rook g8 is mate, and after king d8, rook g8 will be checkmate as well. So, I hope you enjoyed these games today. Pretty cool to win games making several consecutive pawn moves in the opening, but as I mentioned, use caution. There's a reason that winning games with so many pawn moves is so special. It doesn't happen very often. We'll see you next time.